In 1271, a 17-year-old boy from Venice left his home and walked into the largest land empire in human history. His name was Marco Polo. He traveled 4 years to reach the court of Kublai Khan. He crossed deserts that killed entire caravans. He navigated mountain passes that no European had documented. And when he returned 24 years later and tried to describe the route he had taken, the cities he had visited, the trade networks he had moved through, the educated men of Venice called him a liar. The distances were impossible. The wealth he described was impossible. The complexity of the trade networks he mapped was impossible. For a world that had supposedly developed commerce through centuries of gradual human discovery and trial and error, and the accumulated wisdom of generations of merchants who slowly, painfully, learned which routes worked and which routes led to death. What Marco Polo could not tell those educated Venetians, because no human being would understand it for another 700 years, was that he had not discovered those routes. He had not navigated them through courage and intelligence and the accumulated knowledge of generations. He had followed a template so old it predates every civilization that ever used it. A template written not by any human hand, but by the geometry of mountains and the physics of water, and the mathematics of branching systems that every tree on Earth has been using since before the first human being stood upright. Marco Polo walked the Silk Road. The Silk Road follows the drainage basins of the mountain ranges of Central Asia. The drainage basins of those mountain ranges have a branching geometry identical to the root system of a tree. Marco Polo did not know this. Neither did the thousands of merchants who walked those routes before him and after him. Neither did the Roman engineers who built their road network. Neither did the Phoenician sailors who established the Mediterranean trading world. Neither did any civilization in human history until satellite photography in the late 20th century finally gave us the altitude to see what we had always been walking through. Nature wrote the map. We followed it for 10,000 years. And this is the story of how we know that, and why it matters more than almost anything else in the history of human civilization. Before we go to the Silk Road, I want to take you somewhere smaller. I want to take you to a forest. Any forest. A temperate forest, with mature trees and deep root systems, and the kind of rich undergrowth that develops when soil has been building for centuries. If you could see through the earth, if you could pull back the soil like a blanket and look at the root systems of the trees from directly above, you would see something that looks less like a biological structure and more like a map. The roots of a mature tree extend outward from the trunk in a branching pattern. The primary roots extend furthest. From those primary roots, secondary roots branch outward at specific angles. From those secondary roots, tertiary roots branch further still. The whole structure reaches into the soil at every scale, finding water, finding nutrients, connecting to the fungal networks that move resources between trees across hundreds of meters. And the geometry of this branching, the specific angles at which roots meet, the ratios between the length of a primary root and the secondary roots that branch from it, the fractal dimension that describes how the whole structure fills the available space, these are not random. They are the mathematical solution to a specific engineering problem. How do you reach every point in a given territory with the minimum total investment in structure? How do you build a network that distributes resources from everywhere to one central point as efficiently as physics allows? The answer is always the same. You branch. You branch at specific angles. You branch with specific ratios between the scales. You produce a structure with a fractal dimension that sits between 1.4 and 1.6. And then you walk 5,000 miles to a satellite imagery archive, and you look at the mountain ranges of Central Asia from orbital altitude, and you measure their branching geometry, and you get the same number. between 1.4 and 1.6. And then you look at where the Silk Road ran, and you understand for the first time what Marco Polo was actually following. The Silk Road is not a road. This is the first thing to understand, and the thing that almost every popular account of it gets wrong. The Silk Road is a network. A branching network of routes that connected China to the Mediterranean across 5,000 miles of the most challenging terrain on the surface of the planet. The Taklamakan Desert, the Pamir Mountains, the Hindu Kush, the Iranian Plateau, the Anatolian Highlands. These are not places that human beings navigate easily. They are places where entire caravans died from cold and thirst and altitude sickness and the unpredictable violence of the mountain weather systems. And yet, for nearly 2,000 years, from roughly 200 BC to 1400 AD, this network carried silk and spices and glass and gold and ideas and diseases and religions across the entire breadth of Eurasia. Not occasionally, continuously. On a scale that modern economic historians are still revising upward as new evidence comes in. The question that the standard history of the Silk Road never quite answers satisfactorily is how. How did the first merchants find these routes? How did they know which mountain passes were navigable and which were lethal? How did they know where water could be found in deserts that killed the unprepared in days? How did they know which valleys connected to which passes, connected to which river systems, connected to the next inhabitable basin? The standard answer is gradual discovery. Merchants explored. Some died. The survivors reported back. Over generations, the knowledge accumulated and the routes were refined. This answer is true as far as it goes, but it does not explain the speed and precision with which the main Silk Road corridors were established. It does not explain why the primary routes follow the drainage basin boundaries of the Central Asian mountain systems with a fidelity that only became visible with satellite photography. It does not explain why the first merchants, whoever they were, found the geometrically optimal routes through terrain so complex that modern cartographers with GPS and satellite imagery still marvel at the efficiency of the ancient path choices. The geometry explains it. The merchants were not discovering the routes. They were following the valleys. The valleys follow the drainage basins. The drainage basins follow the mountain branching structure. The mountain branching structure follows the same mathematics as tree root systems. The optimal path through a mountain landscape and the optimal path of a tree root through soil are produced by the same mathematical forces. Water finds the lowest point. Roots find the most efficient path to water. Merchants find the lowest energy path through terrain. All three arrive at the same geometric solution, the same branching structure, the same fractal dimension. The template was already written in the shape of the mountains. The merchants read it without knowing they were reading. Let me make this specific. The primary Silk Road corridor, running east to west, follows a sequence of drainage basins and mountain passes that, when plotted on a map and compared to the branching structure of the mountain systems surrounding them, traces the equivalent of a root system reaching from the coast of China to the coast of the Mediterranean. The Hushi corridor in western China, the narrow strip of habitable land between the Tibetan Plateau to the south and the Mongolian Plateau to the north, is the trunk. Everything begins here because this is the geometrically inevitable point where multiple drainage basins converge. It is where a root system would place its main channel because it is where the terrain places its main channel. From the Hushi corridor, the route follows the Tarim Basin, a vast depression surrounded by the Tian Shan Mountains to the north and the Kunlun Mountains to the south. The Tarim Basin is a drainage basin. Its boundaries are defined by the mountain branching on either side. The oasis cities of the Silk Road, Dunhuang, Kashgar, Hotan, sit at the points where subsidiary mountain valleys drain into the main basin. These are the equivalent of the points where secondary routes branch from primary routes. The ancient cities did not choose those locations randomly. The geometry chose them. The water from the mountain valleys created the oases. The oases were the only places in the desert where caravans could survive, and the mountain geometry determined where the oases would be with the same mathematical precision that determines where a route will branch. From the Tarim Basin, the route crosses the Pamirs, the highest mountain system in Central Asia, through specific passes that represent the points of minimum resistance in the mountain branching structure. The same passes used by Alexander the Great's army in 329 BC. The same passes used by the armies of Genghis Khan 15 centuries later. The same passes still used by the modern roads and the one newly constructed highway that crosses the region today. Different civilizations, different centuries, different technologies, same passes. Because the geometry of the mountains does not change, the template does not change, the route does not change, because the route was never a human choice. The Phoenicians understood something about coastal geography that the inland civilizations of the ancient world did not. Or rather, they understood it practically without understanding it theoretically, which is the way almost all human knowledge of the natural template has operated throughout history. The Phoenicians were the dominant maritime trading civilization of the Mediterranean from roughly 1500 to 300 BC. Their trading network connected the eastern Mediterranean to the Atlantic, moving tin from Cornwall in Britain, and silver from Spain, and gold from West Africa, and purple dye made from a specific sea snail found only on the Lebanese coast, to every major port city in the known world. The reach of this network is extraordinary enough. What is more extraordinary is its structure. The Phoenician trading network, plotted as a map of connection between nodes, has a branching geometry that mirrors the branching geometry of the Mediterranean coastline and the mountain drainage systems that reach toward that coastline. The Phoenician home ports in Lebanon, Tyre and Sidon, and Byblos sit at the base of the Levantine highland drainage system. These highlands drain westward toward the Mediterranean in a series of river valleys that the Phoenicians used as access routes to the interior. The Phoenician colonial network extended westward along the African coast, around the bottom of the Iberian Peninsula, following the same geometric logic as a root system extending from a central trunk. Carthage, the greatest Phoenician colony, sits at the geometrically optimal point on the North African coast for controlling access to the Western Mediterranean, not chosen for that reason. Situated there because the mountain drainage system of the North African coastline made that point the natural convergence of multiple resource corridors. Every Phoenician colony, when plotted on a map, sits at a point in the coastal and mountain drainage branching structure that fractal mathematics would predict as the optimal node for a resource distribution network. The Phoenicians did not calculate this. They sailed into harbors that had fresh water, because fresh water meant a river mouth, because a river mouth meant a drainage basin reaching into the interior, because a drainage basin meant resources and agricultural production, and the things a trading network needs to trade. They were following the water. The water was following the mountains. The mountains were branching like roots, and the trading network that resulted was the root system expressed in human commercial terms. The Roman road network is where this argument becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Because the Romans were engineers, they were systematic. They built their roads deliberately, with surveying instruments and mathematical principles, and the enormous organizational capacity of a state that could mobilize tens of thousands of workers across a continent. And the road network they built, the most sophisticated infrastructure project in the ancient world, follows the mountain drainage systems of Europe, with the same fidelity as the Silk Road and the Phoenician trading routes. The Via Appia running south from Rome follows the western Italian coastal drainage system. The Via Flaminia running north follows the Apennine drainage to the Adriatic. The Via Aemilia crossing the Po Valley follows the drainage basin of the Po River, as defined by the Alps to the north and the Apennines to the south. The roads across Gaul, modern France, follow the Rhône-Saône drainage system, and the Loire drainage system, and the Seine drainage system. Each road running along the valley of a major river or its tributary. Each river following the drainage basin defined by the surrounding mountain branching. Roman engineers were not thinking about fractal geometry when they built these roads. They were thinking about gradients and river crossings, and the minimum energy path for moving armies and goods across a landscape. But the minimum energy path through a mountain landscape is determined by the drainage geometry of the mountains, and the drainage geometry of the mountains is determined by the branching structure of the mountain system. And the branching structure of the mountain system has the same fractal dimension as tree roots. The Roman engineers found the optimal routes because the optimal routes were already there, cut into the landscape by water over millions of years. following the geometry that roots and rivers and mountain ranges all share. The Romans paved the template. They did not create it. Here is the thing about this pattern that I want you to sit with, because it is easy to hear all of this and think it is simply a matter of practicality. Of course merchants followed valleys. Of course roads followed rivers. Of course trading networks clustered around harbors where rivers met the sea. These are obvious practical choices that require no sophisticated geometric explanation. And that objection is correct at the level of individual decisions. But it misses what the pattern is actually showing at the level of the whole. The claim is not that individual merchants consciously followed a fractal template. The claim is that the cumulative result of millions of individual practical decisions, each one following the local terrain, following the water, finding the lowest pass, choosing the most sheltered harbor, produced a global trading network whose structure at the large scale is mathematically identical to the branching structure of a tree root system. The local decisions were practical. The global result was geometric. And the geometry was not human. It was the geometry of the Earth itself, of the mountain systems that branch across the surface of every continent, of the drainage basins those mountain systems define, of the rivers that trace those drainage basins to their outlets, all of it sharing the same fractal dimension as the root system of any tree in any forest, in any soil on the planet. The entire history of human trade, from the first exchange of obsidian between prehistoric communities, to the Silk Road, to the Roman highway network, to the Phoenician maritime empire, is the story of human beings finding the paths that the geometry of the Earth had already determined were optimal. Nature wrote the economic map 10,000 years before the first merchant walked it. The merchant simply had the good sense to follow what the landscape was already telling them. The civilizations that understood their drainage basin most thoroughly were always the civilizations that dominated their region most completely. This is the economic history argument that the fractal correspondence makes most directly. Egypt understood the Nile drainage basin completely. Every aspect of Egyptian civilization, the agricultural calendar, the administrative structure, the religious geography, the military campaigns, was organized around the single branching channel of the Nile and its flood cycle. Egypt lasted 3,000 years as a continuous civilization, because the Nile drainage basin is the simplest possible branching structure, a single trunk with minimal branches. And once you understand it fully, there is very little complexity left to navigate. Rome understood the Italian drainage system, and then progressively came to understand the drainage systems of every region it conquered. Roman provincial administration mapped almost exactly onto drainage basin boundaries. The Rhine was not just a military frontier. It was the boundary between two drainage systems. The Danube was not just a river. It was the spine of a drainage basin whose resources Rome exploited for centuries. When Rome stopped understanding its drainage basins, when the administrative capacity to manage resources across multiple connected drainage systems began to fail, the empire contracted back toward the basins it could still manage and finally collapsed into the smaller drainage basin-sized political units that became the kingdoms of medieval Europe. The fall of Rome is in part the story of a political system that expanded beyond the geometric template it understood and contracted when it could no longer read the map the mountains had written. The question that all of this history leads to is one that the standard economic curriculum has never seriously asked. If every ancient trade route follows the mountain drainage geometry, and if that mountain drainage geometry has the same fractal structure as tree root systems, and if this correspondence was invisible to every civilization that lived inside it until satellite photography revealed it in the late 20th century, then what would it have meant for a civilization to understand this correspondence explicitly? Not to follow the template instinctively, as every ancient merchant did, but to understand mathematically that mountain ranges branch like root systems, that drainage basins are the natural units of economic organization, that the optimal points for cities and trading posts and administrative centers can be predicted from the mountain geometry before anyone settles there. What would such a civilization have been capable of? It would have been able to look at an unmapped mountain range and predict where the rivers would run, where the natural harbors would form, where the agricultural surplus would concentrate, where the cities would eventually appear. It would have been able to design trade networks before building them, to choose colonial sites before exploring the coastlines, to predict which regions would become wealthy and which would remain poor based on the branching geometry of their mountain systems, rather than on centuries of trial and error. This is not a minor advantage. This is the most powerful economic planning tool in history, and the fact that no surviving pre-modern text contains an explicit statement of the mountain route geometric correspondence does not mean no civilization ever possessed this knowledge. It means that if such knowledge existed, it did not survive in the texts we have, which is either a coincidence of historical preservation, or it is one more piece of the pattern we have been examining in this series. The deliberate removal of foundational knowledge from the accessible record, leaving behind only the template itself, still written in the geometry of mountains, still branching across every continent, still organizing human economic life along lines that nature determined and humans follow, still waiting for someone to gain enough altitude to see the root system they have been living inside, for the whole of recorded history. Marco Polo returned to Venice in 1295. He had been gone 24 years. He had walked and sailed approximately 15,000 miles. He had moved through a trading network of extraordinary complexity and sophistication. He had followed, without knowing it, the root system of the Eurasian mountain structure from one end to the other. When he dictated his account of what he had seen, the educated men of Venice doubted him. Not because they thought he was lying about the distances, or the wealth, or the complexity of the Eastern trading networks, but because they could not understand how such a network could exist. How human beings and civilizations they had never contacted had organized trade across such distances. How the routes had been found. How the cities had appeared at such perfectly spaced intervals along the corridors. How the whole structure had the appearance of design rather than of the gradual and painful accumulation of practical knowledge that they understood commerce to require. What Marco Polo could not tell them was that it was design, not human design, the design of mountain ranges that branch like root systems, the design of drainage basins that organize economic life along fractal lines, the design of a template so ancient and so fundamental that every civilization that has ever traded across it has followed it without knowing it existed. Nature wrote the map 10,000 years before Marco Polo walked it. 10,000 years before the first Phoenician sailor rounded a headland and found a river mouth and a sheltered harbor and decided this was the right place to stop. 10,000 years before the first Roman engineer surveyed a valley and decided this was where the road should run. The root system was already there. The mountains were already branching. The drainage basins were already defined. The optimal points were already determined. And every civilization in human history has been reading a document it did not know existed. Written in a language it did not know was a language, in the branching geometry of every mountain range on the surface of the earth. The same geometry as the roots beneath your feet, right now, in whatever soil you are standing on, reaching outward from its trunk in the same mathematical pattern as the Silk Road and the Roman highways, and the Phoenician trading routes, and the Rhine Valley commerce, and the Nile agricultural system. All of it the same pattern, all of it the same mathematics. Nature wrote the economic map of human civilization before the first human being was born to walk it. We have been following it ever since. We are following it still, and we are only now beginning to understand what we have been reading.